What if I told you that America's first master brewer was a man who could never legally own his own brewery? Meet Peter Hemings, the enslaved genius who created world-class Alesh and porters at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, impressing foreign diplomats and founding fathers with beverages that rivaled the best European imports. While his beer flowed freely at elite dinner parties, Peter himself remained in chains. This is the story of the brewing mastermind who revolutionized American craft beer, but never tasted true freedom. Born in 1773 at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's sprawling plantation in Virginia, Peter Hemings entered the world as part of one of the most complex and controversial family situations in American history. He was the son of Elizabeth Hemings, a woman of mixed African and European ancestry who had become the matriarch of what would be known as the Hemings family, a group of enslaved people who occupied a unique and privileged position within Jefferson's household due to their blood relationship with his late wife's family. Peter's father was John Wales, Jefferson's father-in-law, making Peter the half-brother of Jefferson's deceased wife Martha, and placing him in the extraordinary position of being both enslaved property and family relation to one of America's most prominent founding fathers. The Hemings family's status at Monticello was unlike that of typical enslaved people on Virginia plantations. While they were legally property and could be bought, sold, or punished at Jefferson's discretion, they were also treated with a level of respect and given opportunities that were virtually unknown among the general enslaved population. Peter grew up in an environment where education, skilled craftsmanship, and intellectual development were valued and encouraged, at least among the Hemings children. This privileged position came with its own psychological burdens, as Peter had to navigate the complex dynamics of being simultaneously family and property, of having access to education and opportunities while remaining legally powerless and dependent on the goodwill of their master. From his earliest childhood, Peter demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for understanding complex processes and systems, particularly those involving chemistry, fermentation, and the transformation of raw materials into finished products. This intellectual curiosity was nurtured by the unusual educational opportunities available to Hemings family members, who were allowed to read, write, and learn skills that would typically be forbidden to enslaved people. Peter's brothers also showed remarkable talents. James became a renowned chef who trained in France, while John worked as a skilled carpenter and musician. The family's collective achievements suggested that their privileged treatment at Monticello, while still occurring within the context of slavery, had allowed extraordinary talents to flourish that might otherwise have been suppressed. The brewing of beer and ale was an essential household industry at Monticello, as it was on most large plantations of the era. Alcoholic beverages were safer to drink than water in many circumstances, and they played important roles in both daily nutrition and social customs. Jefferson, with his interests in science, agriculture, and fine living, was particularly invested in producing high-quality beverages that could compete with the best European imports. He recognized early that Peter possessed not only the intellectual capacity to master the complex science of brewing, but also the artistic sensibility necessary to create products that would satisfy his sophisticated palate and impress his distinguished guests. Under Jefferson's direct tutelage and with access to the best brewing literature and equipment available in America at the time, Peter began to develop expertise that went far beyond simple beer making. He studied the chemistry of fermentation, experimented with different combinations of grains and hops, and mastered the precise timing and temperature control that distinguished excellent brewing from mere competence. His work represented a remarkable fusion of scientific knowledge, artistic creativity, and practical skill that would have been impressive in any context, but was truly extraordinary for an enslaved person in late 18th century America. As Peter matured into adulthood during the 1790s, his role at Monticello evolved from apprentice to master craftsman, with Jefferson increasingly relying on his expertise to manage all aspects of beer and ale production for the plantation. This responsibility encompassed not only the brewing process itself, but also the cultivation and processing of the grains and hops necessary for production, the maintenance and operation of complex brewing equipment, and the training of other workers who assisted in various aspects of the operation. Peter's workspace became a sophisticated laboratory where he could experiment with different techniques and recipes, always seeking to improve the quality and consistency of his products. The brewing operation at Monticello under Peter's direction was remarkable for both its scale and its sophistication. Jefferson's correspondence from this period includes numerous references to the quality of the beer produced by his brewing expert, and visitors to Monticello frequently commented on the excellence of the beverages served at Jefferson's table. Peter was producing not just the simple small beer that was common on most plantations, but also complex Alesh and porters that required advanced knowledge of fermentation science and considerable artistic skill to balance flavors and achieve the desired characteristics. Jefferson's confidence in Peter's abilities was demonstrated by his willingness to invest significant resources in expanding and improving the brewing operation. New equipment was purchased, specialized facilities were constructed, and Peter was given considerable autonomy to make decisions about production methods and resource allocation. This level of trust and responsibility was virtually unprecedented in master-slave relationships of the era, reflecting both Peter's exceptional competence and Jefferson's recognition that his brewing operation had become an important source of both personal pride and economic value for the plantation. Peter's brewing expertise also extended beyond Monticello, as Jefferson began to share his enslaved brewers' knowledge with other plantation owners and agricultural enthusiasts throughout Virginia. Peter's recipes and techniques were discussed in correspondence between Jefferson and other prominent figures, and his reputation as a master brewer began to spread throughout the region. This recognition was both a source of pride and a reminder of his peculiar status as someone whose achievements brought honor to his master, while his own legal status remained that of property. The complexity of Peter's brewing operation required him to develop skills that went far beyond the technical aspects of fermentation. He had to manage supply chains for raw materials, coordinate with other plantation operations that provided grains and other inputs, maintain detailed records of production processes and outcomes, and train and supervise other workers. These management responsibilities demonstrated leadership abilities and business acumen that would have qualified him for significant positions in the commercial world, had he been born free. His success in these roles provided compelling evidence that enslaved people possessed the same intellectual and creative capabilities as their masters, given appropriate opportunities and encouragement. By the early 1800s, Peter Hemings had achieved something unprecedented in American brewing. He had become widely recognized as one of the finest brewers in the country, with his products rivaling the best imported Alesh and earning praise from some of the most sophisticated palates in American society. Jefferson's dinner parties, famous for their intellectual conversation and refined cuisine, regularly featured Peter's brewing creations, and guests including foreign diplomats, fellow founding fathers, and prominent merchants consistently praised the quality of the beverages served. This recognition placed Peter in the extraordinary position of being simultaneously one of America's most accomplished craftsmen and a piece of human property whose achievements legally belonged to his master. The paradox of Peter's situation became even more pronounced as his reputation spread beyond Virginia to other states and even to international markets. Jefferson began receiving inquiries from other plantation owners, commercial brewers, and even foreign visitors who wanted to learn from Peter's techniques or purchase examples of his work. Some visitors to Monticello specifically requested opportunities to meet and observe Peter at work, treating him with the respect typically accorded to master craftsmen, while legally he remained subject to Jefferson's absolute authority and could theoretically be sold, punished, or disposed of at will. This recognition also created practical complications for Jefferson, who found himself in the awkward position of having to explain and justify his reliance on an enslaved expert whose abilities clearly exceeded those of most free craftsmen. While Jefferson was proud of Peter's achievements and the reflected glory they brought to Monticello, he was also aware that Peter's obvious competence and sophistication raised uncomfortable questions about the intellectual justifications for slavery that Jefferson and other slaveholders used to rationalize their ownership of human beings. Peter's brewing expertise became so well established that Jefferson began to consider the possibility of using his skills as a source of commercial revenue beyond the plantation's immediate needs. Plans were discussed for expanding production to supply local markets, and Jefferson explored the possibility of establishing Peter as the master brewer for a commercial operation that would generate significant profits while still maintaining the legal fiction that Peter was merely an unusually skilled piece of property. These discussions revealed the fundamental contradictions in a system that could recognize and profit from an enslaved person's genius while denying their basic humanity and rights. The brewing equipment and facilities at Monticello under Peter's management had evolved into what amounted to a small commercial brewery, complete with specialized vessels for different stages of the fermentation process, climate-controlled storage areas for aging, and sophisticated systems for quality control and consistency. Peter had essentially created a model for American craft brewing that was decades ahead of its time, demonstrating techniques and achieving quality standards that would not become common in American brewing until well into the 19th century. His innovations included experiments with different grain combinations, novel approaches to hop utilization, and temperature control methods that maximized the efficiency and quality of the fermentation process. During the 1810s and 1820s, Peter Hemings' brewing operation at Monticello had evolved into something approaching a commercial enterprise, with regular customers throughout central Virginia and occasional special orders for significant events and celebrations. Jefferson, always eager to demonstrate American capabilities in competition with European standards, took particular pride in serving Peter's Alesh and porters to foreign visitors, using them as examples of how American craftsmanship could equal or exceed the products of older, more established brewing traditions. This commercial success created a complex dynamic where Peter's expertise was generating significant value and prestige for Jefferson, while Peter himself remained legally powerless and economically dependent. The financial aspects of Peter's brewing work became increasingly important to Monticello's economic viability, as Jefferson's personal finances became more precarious in his later years. The sale of beer and ale produced by Peter provided a steady source of income that helped offset the mounting debts that would eventually threaten the entire plantation. Ironically, Peter's enslaved labor was helping to sustain the very system that kept him in bondage, creating a situation where his success as a brewer was directly connected to the continuation of his own enslavement and that of his family members. Peter's reputation had grown to the point where he was consulted by other brewery operations throughout Virginia and neighboring states, with entrepreneurs and plantation owners seeking his advice on establishing their own brewing programs. These consultations, always conducted with Jefferson's permission and often with his direct involvement, demonstrated Peter's expertise while highlighting the absurdity of a system where one of America's leading brewing experts could not legally own property, enter into contracts, or even travel freely to share his knowledge. The consultations also generated additional income for Jefferson, who was essentially renting out Peter's expertise while Peter himself received no direct compensation beyond his basic maintenance as an enslaved person. The sophistication of Peter's brewing methods attracted attention from scientific and agricultural societies that were interested in documenting and promoting advances in American manufacturing and agriculture. Jefferson's correspondence includes references to requests for detailed information about Peter's techniques, and some of Peter's innovations were discussed in agricultural journals and scientific publications of the era. However, these discussions typically credited Jefferson as the source of the innovations, reflecting the legal reality that enslaved people could not own intellectual property and that their achievements were automatically attributed to their masters. Peter's work also contributed to broader changes in American drinking culture and brewing practices during this period. His emphasis on quality control, consistency, and the use of local ingredients helped establish standards and methods that influenced other brewers throughout the region. The techniques he developed for working with Virginia-grown grains and hops helped demonstrate that American-produced beverages could compete with imported products, contributing to a growing sense of American cultural and economic independence from European models. In this way, Peter's individual expertise contributed to broader national developments in manufacturing and commerce, even though he could not directly benefit from the economic opportunities created by these changes. As Peter Hemings aged during the 1820s and early 1830s, his role at Monticello gradually shifted from active production to training and supervision of younger workers who would carry on the brewing operation under his guidance. This transition was complicated by Jefferson's death in 1826 and the subsequent financial crisis that engulfed the Monticello estate, forcing the sale of most enslaved people to satisfy Jefferson's enormous debts. Peter's expertise and the value of the brewing operation provided some protection for him and a few other skilled Hemings family members, but the uncertainty surrounding the estate's future created considerable anxiety about whether the brewing program would continue and what would happen to the people whose lives and livelihoods depended on it. The dispersal of Jefferson's estate highlighted one of the fundamental tragedies of Peter's situation. Despite having created what amounted to a significant business enterprise and having achieved recognition as one of America's leading brewing experts, he had no legal ownership of his work, no claim to the facilities and equipment he had developed, and no control over his own future or that of his family. The brewing operation that represented decades of his innovation and expertise could be sold, dismantled, or transferred to new ownership without any consideration of his wishes or interests, demonstrating the fundamental powerlessness that defined enslaved people's lives regardless of their achievements or contributions. Peter's death in 1834 marked the end of an extraordinary career that had demonstrated the possibilities for black excellence even within the constraints of slavery, while also illustrating the profound limitations and injustices of a system that could recognize and profit from enslaved people's talents while denying their basic humanity and rights. His innovations in brewing technique and his reputation for quality had established standards and methods that influenced American brewing for decades, yet his contributions were largely forgotten or attributed to others as the memory of his achievements became separated from recognition of his identity and status. The legacy of Peter Hemings as America's first black master brewer provides important insights into both the potential for black achievement and the systematic barriers that prevented such achievements from being fully recognized or rewarded during the slavery era. His story demonstrates that the absence of black entrepreneurs and craftsmen in traditional historical narratives reflects not any lack of capability or ambition, but rather the legal and social structures that prevented enslaved people from owning businesses, accumulating wealth, or receiving credit for their innovations and expertise. Modern craft brewing enthusiasts and historians who have rediscovered Peter's story recognize him as a pioneering figure whose techniques and standards helped establish American brewing as a legitimate alternative to European imports, and whose innovations anticipated many of the methods that would later be associated with the craft brewing renaissance of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. His emphasis on quality ingredients, careful attention to fermentation science, and willingness to experiment with new techniques established a template for American brewing excellence that continues to influence contemporary practitioners. Perhaps most importantly, Peter Hemings' story serves as a reminder that enslaved people were not merely victims of historical circumstances, but were also active agents who created value, developed innovations, and contributed to American economic and cultural development in ways that have often been overlooked or minimized in traditional historical accounts. His achievements as a master brewer represent just one example of the countless contributions that enslaved people made to American society, contributions that deserve recognition not only for their intrinsic merit, but also for what they reveal about the human potential that slavery sought to suppress and deny. The brewing industry that Peter helped to establish at Monticello continued in various forms for several years after his death, with other enslaved people carrying on the techniques he had developed, though none achieved his level of expertise or recognition. Eventually, the operation was dismantled as the Monticello estate was divided and sold, but the influence of Peter's methods and standards continued to spread throughout Virginia's brewing community through the people he had trained and the visitors who had observed his work. In this way, his legacy lived on even after his death, contributing to the development of American brewing traditions that would eventually evolve into one of the world's most innovative and successful industries.